Hi everyone, welcome to the IPython/Jupyter dev meeting for Thursday, July 17th. And yeah, welcome. We're just back from SciPy, and I suppose we have a few things to talk about.
John.
Oh, yes, I'm up first on the list. So, all in favor of removing widget from every single widget? Say aye.
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 Sure. Do we want to?
It's two ayes.
Yeah, two ayes and a sure. Abstention. Do you want to deprecate the old names, or are we breaking enough stuff in widgets that the 2 to 3 transition is going to be painful enough?
We could deprecate them, I suppose, because I think the widgets will behave the same. The things that we're breaking are like custom widgets.
Okay.
Well, but the custom widgets that people are subclassing widgets are going to break if we don't deprecate, right?
Yeah, I'm fine deprecating.
Yeah, I think we should. I think that's good because it is a piece of code that people are extending and or they're using it in ways that it would be a pain to support both versions of IPython.
Yeah.
Do we want to just assign int_slider widget equals int_slider?
Well, then nobody will know it's deprecated.
So you do want to...
You can write a toy shim that if you that creates that makes a subclass
and raises deprecation.
Deprecated subclass that raises deprecation on or shows deprecation on instantiation.
Okay.
Because it would just be, in init Warren deprecate.
Yeah.
This is my real name. Super, and then you're done.
Yeah. As long as that doesn't. No, I guess that. Yeah. I was just trying to think if someone creates a bunch of widgets and in a cell and then displays those widgets in that cell, if the deprecation warnings are basically going to make it unusable.
Well, those warnings should appear once, right? Not on once per class.
That would make sense.
Okay, I mean, yeah, as long as we can just try it out, as long as it doesn't become just ridiculous when people use the old APIs. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, we can probably finagle it. It would be a little bit trickier, but we could probably finagle it so that you only get one warning ever. It would be easy. It's easy to make it. Then the simple way to do it, you get one warning per widget class.
Yeah. No, I mean we could just set a global in the widgets module.
Well, warnings already deal with this kind of thing. It's just where the warning comes from. So you can basically put in a deprecated widget mix in, and then that's how you create that shows the warning, and then that's how you create the deprecated subclasses.
Okay.
Should I deprecate on the front end too then?
No.
No, because we're not going to rename it in the front end. It doesn't make sense.
Well, why wouldn't we rename the front end classes as well?
Because they don't belong to a widget namespace. And there's views and models. So it's
Oh, that's right. It's views and models, not. Does the word widget ever appear in the class names? Like, is it int_slider widget view, int_slider?
No, I think it's just int_slider view.
Okay, that's what I. Yeah. If the word widget appears there, remove it.
Yeah.
Right. Did the widget working group at the sprints come to any kind of conclusion about widgets and models and views and display and all the bizarre terminology that doesn't do what it sounds like it's doing?
No, we were working at the roadmap level rather than technical details on any particular thing.
Well,
Yeah.
there was a group talking about technical details, I know, because I was in it for a while until I got fed up.
So
I'm really asking John after I dropped out of that discussion, did it get anywhere?
No, the discussion changed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. John, we should probably convert that roadmap to something useful and public.
Yeah, the hackpad.
No, well, in the spreadsheet that we generated that day.
Yep. I mean, it's public. It's linked under the IPython org hackpads.
Okay.
Yeah, but somewhere slightly more
Yeah.
Findable.
over the wiki or something.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to add that to the roadmap wiki page, for example, that probably.
Just a minor point on the back to the deprecation stuff. So we should, I think it'd be good if we could just backport the new names to 2x as well. So again, so the people can, so at least in 2 and 3, following either of the conventions would work, and then we drop the more explicit sort of widget in the name down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, nobody will. There's no incentive for you to. There's a disincentive for you to code against the 3 code base, because that won't work in 2.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea, Paul.
Yeah, we can do that. And not backport the deprecation.
Right, yeah.
Okay, just backport the short name equals long name.
Yeah,
long
yeah,
name equals short name.
Yeah.
Okay, so it will be a different,
Yeah,
a totally different pair. Okay, yeah,
I'll do
that
it.
makes sense.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that.
just do that as a separate PR against 2x.
Oh, okay.
That makes sense.
And the other thing I had on the list, I think we already resolved, but just upgrading less. I think we can do that without having to worry about line breaks, because we don't care about that, right?
Yeah, it will make the diffs and blobs and whatever slightly bigger for CSS changes, but whatever, that's how less works. It's fine.
Simply means the repository will grow somewhat quicker because effectively every time you change the CSS, it has to store a whole new file.
Yeah, and it's ever so slightly different from that because it's one line per, like, so you can put comments. There are comments that less will preserve. So it would only update like that line. So like if you update IPython CSS, it would change. You'd get because Git is bad at storing diffs. Well, it doesn't actually store. Like IPython's a line, Bootstrap's a line, etc. So it's not one big line, it's a small number of lines. And we can actually, if we want, we can make it one line per file of ours because we can put those comments anywhere we want. I would be inclined to do it between either one for all of IPython or one for each of IPython's kind of domains, like notebook, tree, etc. Does anybody know what I'm talking about there? What, should I take silence as a yes? Everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
So one of the disadvantages of later versions of less is they squash line breaks unconditionally. Although clean CSS lets you preserve line breaks, and that maybe we can switch that someday.
But he said that, yeah, he said that doesn't work, right?
Yeah. But the we can. Yeah, we should upgrade less.
Yeah, I absolutely. There's no. I mean, in general, we should probably just, you know, we should be in the pattern of updating our dependencies.
Yeah, it's just we wanted to pin it so that we updated it deliberately rather than up and down and then back and forth.
Yeah.
Sense.
But yeah, I think updating less makes sense at this point.
Yep. Thomas, display names for kernels?
Yes. So in PR, whatever number it is, with the UI switching kernels.
6126.
Thank you, man. What do we want to display as the name of the kernels? So at the moment, I've just got it with like the language name. So, you know, Python 2, Python 3, R, Bash, whatever. Obviously, it's up to kernel authors, but whatever we do will probably set a pattern. Do we want it to display as Python, as IPython? If you know, we probably want to have some distinction between Python 2 and Python 3. If we call it IPython, how do we do that? Also, when the notebook UI is rebranded to Julia, then you know that the kernel name is the only spot where
Jupiter, you mean? You said Julia.
Oh, Jupiter.
Yeah.
The kernel name is the only spot where it would say IPython. So, yeah. Anybody have any strong views on this?
I think that field should. I guess my initial thought is to use the language name, because that's what users will be thinking of at that point. They'll be less concerned that, oh, my Python 3 kernel is being provided by such and such project, than they are concerned that I just want to write Python 3 code.
Yes, but then the flip side is that you can do more. You know, it is IPython syntax, not just Python syntax. We extend the language in certain ways.
Do other kernels extend their syntax in the notebook as well?
I know iJulia has talked about a Magix-like thing.
But would
I don't know if they've implemented it?
But would they implement that in the Julia language itself?
No, I think it was a iJulia type
Okay.
project, but I don't know if they did it.
I mean, part of it is I think I want to avoid the situation where where these lines start to specify both the version of the programming language and the version of the kernel. Right? You don't want to have the field read IPython 3, Python 2, and IPython 2, IPython 3. I mean, and this is where maybe we need two different fields in the spec, right?
Those fields are separate in the spec.
Yeah,
It's just the display name that.
And what exactly? So what fields we have in the spec? We have the name of the kernel, which is like iJulia and IPython, and then the name of the language.
Yeah. And then a separate thing from both of those, there is a field I have called display name, which is intended specifically for this purpose of you can display it in a list.
Yeah, so all we're talking about is the convention for display name, for what should be on the page.
I mean,
plus there is the possibility that people may have more than one kernel for the same language, either because there's multiple environments with the same language and they're creating separate kernels for them, or because there are we have 15 separate kernel projects. It's got to be only a matter of time before we end up with a language with 2 competing kernels.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's reasonable to, and the display name may not be the language. Like if I were creating a if I created a kernel spec to start a kernel in a particular virtual environment, I could make it my testing 1, 2, 3 kernel, and that's information for me. I know that means Python 3 in my whatever virtual env, or I could have a conda. I could have a conda kernel, and I could have a canopy kernel, so the main thing is, what should the name of the plain IPython ships with IPython, should it be called? Should we take the kernel project name? Should it take the language name? I lean slightly towards language, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think in many cases the language will be the clearer thing for the user, but I think that will create more confusion in cases where you do have, where we do end up with competing kernel projects for the same language, especially because these display names, nothing enforces their exclusivity, so you could end up with multiple entries in the list with the same display name, which there's no easy way to tell which is which. And also because of this thing that I think the IPython brand is worth keeping around somewhere, and if the notebook becomes Jupyter branded, then the kernel name is the only place that it will say IPython.
Yeah, then I think we have to include the project and the language in that. I don't see. Maybe Julia won't have to include their language as well, because there hasn't been a sort of a.
They're not in the middle of a transition where it's reasonable to be using 2 versions at once. Exactly,
and whereas Python is, and so maybe it's IPython / Python 3.
Yeah.
It's not for simple usage cases. It's sort of annoying, but I think it is a global namespace for all projects, and so I think having sort of project name / language name is a reasonable convention.
Yeah, especially given that you're going to want to allow, like we talked about, sort of having languages, multiple kernels for language. You want to also allow it to have multiple sort of kernels for, like, maybe I'm going to want an IPython 2, and then an IPython 2.1 and an IPython 3, and each of those under Python 2 and Python 3, and so.
Yeah. So for personal use, you can name it whatever you want. We may have a whole bunch of kernel specs for using different, and starting the kernel in a different environment with different versions of IPython.
So actually, here's another alternative, and that is, what about making the items in the drop-down, when you hover over them, they display more information about that kernel?
Yeah, that makes sense.
That at least provides, if someone does have duplicate kernel display names, they can at least inspect and see, oh, okay, this is the one that has Python 3, even though it says something simpler.
So would you just use IPython in that case, and then you'd have two IPythons, and you have to hover to see which one's
No,
Python 2? Or...
I think it's probably still a good idea to provide. And part of it is I don't think we should get into a situation where that display name also displays the version of the project. Like I think it's too much to say IPython 3.
No, well, I mean, for our personal use, we will probably end up doing things like that. But for public use, no, I agree.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking that's a way of sort of, I don't know, that's.
Okay, and so stick with IPython no version, Python version.
Yeah, and also the other issue is it's entirely possible and likely that when people install, actually, maybe we've thought about this, or maybe we haven't, is what if I install IPython 3 using apt-get, Anaconda, and Canopy on the same system?
Uh-huh.
How many IPython kernels will show up in the UI?
I think just one, right?
Yes.
It's possible that apt is the only one that's likely to do something slightly silly and add itself in a different place.
So apt will install the kernel spec into a system-wide registry rather than a per-user registry, but if it uses the same name, then it will only show up once.
Subsequent installations will overwrite.
Yeah. So, well, not overwrite, but there's the display name which you show humans.
Yes.
But there's also the kernel's name, which is a unique key.
Yes.
And there's a search path style thing. So if you've got a Python kernel that's just called Python in .ipython, and you've got a Python kernel that's just called Python in user share,
yep,
you won't be able to start the one in user share because that gets clobbered.
But in fact, the IPython, our own kernel, is a little bit special cased in the notebook server, so it will start up with whatever Python is running the notebook server.
Okay. Yeah. I guess that's good. I guess the case that I'm worried about is where someone, I do this at times where I have multiple Pythons installed and I switch between them by changing my path, and I would like to be able to do that and not have to also change my IPython config files and reinstall kernel specs. The other situation I don't want to run into is where the user installs multiple Pythons in some random order, and the one that's currently in their path is not the last one they installed, and the notebook doesn't work. That's the other failure mode I want to avoid.
With the current special casing of the default kernel, I think that won't be an issue.
Okay, because it's the same. It does the same install.
I could imagine manual installs causing confusion. Like if you say, this is my Python 3, you explicitly make a Python 3 or Python, not my current Python kernel, other Python kernel, and you point that to Anaconda, and then you install with apt, and you're doing all these things you might have. That might be slightly surprising, but it would only be a result of something you did, and it wouldn't affect the default kernel.
Okay. So right now, the multiple installations of the same kernel clobber each other.
That depends on what you mean.
Well, the kernel can be installed into separate places. The kernel spec tells it where to look.
Yeah, see, I think that I think we probably have to change that because in an ideal world, all of our users would only ever install Python once, but in practice,
I don't understand what you mean by change.
so that someone can simultaneously have the IPython kernel installed from a bunch of different Python distributions.
Yeah, and
So
normally that it will use. So under normal circumstances, the way that works is your kernel will run in the same Python as the notebook server. Every time. It uses sys.executable, basically.
But for all non-default kernels, this is a problem.
Right. That if you pick an explicit Python.
Well, all non-Python kernels, right? I mean, only Python has sys.executable.
But I mean, this seems like, if you install a bunch of versions of the same thing, then whichever one you installed last is probably the one that ends up.
So if you put in the first field Julia as the executable, then your path will determine which Julia starts. If you've got 10 Julias, and the executable at the beginning of the kernel command is Julia, and not an absolute path, then setting your path will do it.
And that information is provided by the kernel specs.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's something we want to be careful about when telling people.
Yeah.
How to write kernel specs. But I think using the base name of the executable rather than the absolute path is probably the right thing to do in most cases.
Okay, no, I think that absolutely addresses this issue because you basically want path to be a global switch on those things.
Yeah, and then sometimes I might want to create a kernel that is hard coded to, like I might want to create a kernel spec that's like use my Python in this conda environment.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's okay. No, so yeah, I think that's fine.
So Brian, I assume you've reviewed the content service?
I've started. Yeah,
Okay.
this is no, but I do I am almost dug out of my backlog from SciPy, and so I mean, I have good working time this week and next week, so this shouldn't be a problem. Once August hits, it's going to be pretty bad.
Okay. Coalesce stream. So I have a PR that is.
Oh, actually, hold on. Sorry. There's a few things to talk about with the contents that came up in the SciPy sprints and talking with Kester about Google Drive integration. So at the sprints, some work was started with Jeff and Kester on splitting out making a JavaScript contents manager class.
Right, splitting the talking to the REST API from talking to the UI on the page.
Yep, and they were basically they looked and did a study to try to understand what does that contents JavaScript API need to look like so that we can implement it for both our REST API and Google Drive, and how does the UI talk to that? And I think the big conceptual question is multiple checkpoints. And basically the Google Drive API supports multiple checkpoints.
Yeah, the Contents API supports multiple checkpoints too.
So that was my first question. It does support multiple checkpoints.
Well, I should say, in theory,
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, the API is lists checkpoints. You get checkpoints by key. It's just the file content, because we don't want to re-implement version control with dumb file copies. The file contents manager that we ship only creates one. Creating a checkpoint removes the last one.
Yes.
But the API is absolutely list checkpoints. The design is based on multiple checkpoints. It's just
Okay.
we don't have a manager that supports multiple checkpoints, but the API does.
Okay, so
Now, the caveat of that is that nobody's actually built something with multiple checkpoints that I know of. So there may be some silly little things that make it not work, but that is absolutely what it's supposed to do.
Okay, and I guess part of it is we need to understand the UI for managing checkpoints that Google Drive offers.
Uh-huh.
And basically, what happens when you go back to a checkpoint previously? Do you have the option to delete checkpoints selectively? Do you have, and we would need to expose those things.
Yeah, you can delete checkpoints with REST. There's no human UI for it.
Okay. And then Jeff, I mean, the thing that got Jeff working on this was that he wants multiple checkpoints in the standard manager.
No.
And I gave him the usual story, and then Fernando gave him the usual story, and then we started to think about Google Drive, and both Fernando and I said, we may need to rethink this.
With the APIs, like I really very strongly think we should not support multiple checkpoints, because you're just going to end up with a crap load of copy files that nobody cares about.
I know.
Like if you want multiple checkpoints on the file system, you write the contents manager that understands Git. That's the only sensible way to do it.
Well, although Fernando brought up a good point, and he said the reason we've resisted this before is that it's a slippery slope to reinventing Git. That's absolutely a horrible idea. And what the new realization was that the Google Drive abstraction of checkpoints constrains what we're buying into in supporting multiple checkpoints. It's basically saying, look, we are not reinventing Git here. Don't ask us to do things that Git would do, but we are going to implement something that's consistent with what the Google Drive style checkpointing offers.
I strongly disagree.
Okay. No, but I mean, I'm just updating everyone on sort of what those discussions were. I'm not at all convinced that we should implement multiple checkpoints as well.
Yeah. Jason. Jason has a good point. We could also just use ZFS. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I've actually heard anyone asking for more checkpointing stuff. As in,
Yeah. No, that I
had more rollback points to go to. It just doesn't seem to be a concern. In fact, I think very few people would cry if the checkpoint thing disappeared altogether and we just auto-saved all the time.
No, a couple of people would. Fernando would.
A couple of people would, but I think the numbers would be pretty small.
Yes. Absolutely, and I think this is a perfect example of where we have at least sort of informal user data that we should pay attention to. And I agree. My experience is that most people don't have any idea that checkpoints are happening.
Yeah, it's just, because the only reason we added checkpoints was because there were parties who felt that autosave, clobbering autosave was unacceptable. So we added, manual save writes a different file, which we decided to call checkpoints.
Yeah.
But, that's the reason they exist, is so that we had strictly, in terms of possible data loss, it is impossible for IPython to lose more data than before we had autosave.
Yeah.
Because we we write one file in exactly the same way we did with explicit save, and we write a different file with autosave.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Okay. Coalesce streams. I have a PR. So in NBConvert and in the UI for the notebook, we do a thing where we take multiple stream messages and basically merge them into a single. If you've got a bunch of print statements with a bunch of flushes, you'll get many separate stream outputs. And when you get a bunch of consecutive stream outputs on the same stream, we append them to the same HTML element, but we don't merge the stream outputs themselves. Does that make sense? So if you have like a progress bar, you can end up with 1,000 outputs in the notebook document, but one logical output displayed.
Right.
And we re-implement this in various places, and then we convert, and because you need to do this kind of no matter what. And so I have a PR that does this in the document itself.
And when you say in the document itself, do you mean like in save and load?
No, I mean so in master, when a new stream output comes in, we say, all right, just append that to the outputs list of the JSON document structure. And then if the last output was the same stream,
Append
something slightly different, append it to the previous one, and if otherwise, make a new output that's a stream output.
I understand.
And what this does is is apply the logic we do with the display and apply it in both places. That's if this output is a stream output, instead of appending to the outputs list, append the data to the previous output. And the main reason to do that is if you've got these progress bar things that make a bunch of small outputs, your notebook document can get big, especially if you've got carriage returns that actually delete data. And two, notebook load, because adding an individual output is not the cheapest thing in the world. If you've got 1 million small stream outputs, notebook load can be 30 seconds or a minute. And then doing this merge can take a notebook that loads in a minute to a notebook that loads in 2 seconds.
So I think conceptually I understand how this would work and why it would be good in the case of just a bunch of textual output that arrives in separate messages. I guess where I'm not quite as clear is like in a progress bar situation where you have clear output calls in between. How would that, because then your
clear output has always just deleted outputs.
And what does it do in the document?
It deletes all outputs.
From the document as well?
Yeah. The outputs are actually gone.
Yes.
Does this also, like, if you have multiple consecutive outputs with carriage returns between them, does it collapse those so that you...
Yeah, it stores the result, so which includes whatever character's carriage return deletes. I mean, which means it includes the deletion. Like, basically, what's stored in the document is what you see.
So if I print like 1 carriage return flush, 2 carriage return flush, 3 carriage return flush, then only 3 carriage return will be stored.
Right.
Yeah, I'm in favor of that.
Yeah, basically it means that what you store in the document is what you see at the end. Because right now when we load a progress bar on the page, we actually replay the entire lifetime of the progress bar. Now, assuming it's a progress bar that uses a terminal progress bar that uses carriage return, not clear output.
That's the point I was confused by. I was thinking you were talking about progress bars with clear output, and I was...
Yeah, most progress bars don't use clear output. They use carriage return.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
And those we actually replay right now in master, we replay the entire life of the progress bar. Just so fast that you can't actually see it, although it's not actually fast, but and this would basically only store in the document the final view. Brand's making a confused face. So if you have 100 print statements that are like print 10%, carriage return, print 20%, carriage return, print 30%, carriage return, print 100%, you would only, stored in the document, there would only be the 100%.
Because when you view it, that's all you will see as well.
Right.
And so they remind me of what exact sequence of characters indicates clear output in this context.
/R, like carriage return is.
Okay.
It clears a line.
It clears one line.
Okay, and so you're saying not only will we coalesce screams, we will do that in a way that's smart about carriage return.
Yes, we will do, basically, we already do that.
We just don't save it back.
It's just we just don't save. We already do that for display. We already do that in NB Convert. We do it everywhere.
Okay.
It's just we save the result of that rather than.
Okay. No, I totally understand now, and I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
And the disadvantage is that it breaks the notebook document is a log of output notion, but I think it.
But if you're doing clear output, then that's not the case anyway.
Yes. No.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Then I will. Okay.
And Mint, is there no cost to doing this as new output comes in?
The cost is already. We're already doing the computation.
Oh, because we're adding it to the same element.
Yeah, we're just storing. Okay. We're just
gotcha.
We're just doing outputs -1 dot text equals instead of outputs dot append.
Cool. Yeah.
So I think the cost for displaying a new output is basically the same.
Yeah.
Because we're already computing all the logic for whether we should coalesce the stream.
Mm-hmm.
So it's even the same branches and everything.
Yeah. Now this will be a big help because it's one of those cases where we talk about the notebook as like this great thing, and it's completely been unusable for things that have lots of output. Like I was trying to do the git commit history read writes for the collaboratory stuff, and I was trying to do that in the notebook, and for very small things it would work, and then when I wanted to rewrite all of history where Git would give me all this output, that's it. Like I couldn't. I was dead in the water. I had to just do it manually and write a shell script, and I think this will help a lot with that.
Yeah, and Fernando and I started to talk about some of that on a bus ride in Austin, sort of about how do we start to refactor the output collapse scroll, and it's not just collapse and scroll, it's actually preventing, who cares if you can scroll through large output if that output crashes your notebook?
Right.
and John and I watched a class that Jen Clay taught. The class was doing presentations, and there was multiple notebooks that those students had that basically had this problem, and it was just painful to watch. It really was. And so I don't know. All I'm saying is Fernando has started to talk about this. We had no profound conclusions yet, but it's definitely a huge problem still.
Yeah, and another slightly bigger, more delicate problem is actually not displaying outputs that are too big.
Like not just completely not doing it.
Yeah, and having it just right, because it's when you've got a million, append display calls, those are expensive and can get the notebook stuck. And so having I've got a flood of output, I'm just going to hold it in memory, because it's not the messages arriving and remembering them that takes time. It's modifying the DOM and all that stuff. So if we just stored them over here and said, you got a lot of output, you're going to have to tell me explicitly that you want to see it.
Yeah.
And the current collapse scroll doesn't help anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
The only thing it helps is that you don't have to scroll as far to get to the next cell.
Yeah.
Which is also why I turn it off.
Yeah. So yeah, and although sometimes, I mean, like I've seen people run a cell that outputs hundreds of matplotlib plots, and there it's the in-memory footprint eventually starts to be significant, even if it's not in the DOM. And the other problem with large output is that I've noticed is that if a user has a lot of output, it's very likely that they will have no idea how much output they actually have. Because if they did, they would not have tried to show it.
Yeah.
And so it's every bit as likely, once output gets beyond a certain size, it's every bit as likely that it will be 50 gigabytes as it will be 50 megabytes.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's really. Yeah.
Might think about doing like a at the risk of, or maybe this is something that would go and do something like the software carpentry training wheels profile for IPython, but having like an auto capture once you've hit that sort of that output size. So like a safety harness for you, just so you don't sit there waiting for the 50 gigabytes to load.
And that's easy as long as the kernel is local to the server, right?
Yeah.
The kernel could say, I've sent this many. It can, because we know every byte that goes through, send it out. We can say, I sent 30 messages. Start buffering, or 300 messages, whatever's reasonable. Start buffering on the kernel, but then it becomes. It's easy to do that with. If you can assume everything is local, it starts to become trickier if the kernel might be somewhere else.
No, I mean, it's entirely possible, for example, that each time the kernel detects that they're writing to a new, basically the parent ID changes, so there's a new cell that's receiving output.
Yeah.
It could actually cache that. And if the cache gets beyond a certain size, it could just stop and write it to a file.
Who could stop? The kernel?
The kernel could stop sending more messages and write the rest of that output to a particular file and send some way of communicating that to the front end that, look, this is too big, we're not going to show me. But if you want to, do exclamation head on this file or tail, like it's there and you can.
And we absolutely could, I think we've talked about it a long time ago, but in preserving the non-assumption that kernels are local, right, we are running Tornado. So we do not assume that the kernel is on the same system.
Yes.
There are no assumptions.
Yes.
That the kernel is local in IPython.
But
we could, because we know where the kernel is, or we know a port that points to the kernel, an IPN port that points to the kernel, and the kernel is running Tornado, we could absolutely just proxy an HTTP handler that's like kernel stuff.
Yeah.
And then writing stuff to the file on the kernel. It just gets proxied, and then it would be fine.
Although I think if files are really that big, the user should be approaching them not with their eyes but with code.
Yeah, but I just mean if the file existing at all, it means either we have to have a way of getting files from the kernel, or we have to eliminate, or we have to add the assumption that kernels are local. Like those are the only two options.
Why not just tell users, look, once output gets beyond a certain size, we write the file locally, and you need to use you need to use Python code to figure out what to do with that file. Like, make it hard for them to, like, we don't want to, if the file is really that big, we don't want to make it easy for them to say, I want to look at this.
You can't cat the file because then it'll write it to a new file.
No. But this is why I want to make it hard for the user. They need to understand that the only time we do this is when you can't look at it with your eyes. And so don't try to look at it with your eyes. At least not the whole thing.
That's a reasonable. Where do we put the file though? Because Sage has like a whole directory structure of the notebook, which affords obvious places to save long output. We can put it in the working directory, but if you're running into this regularly, then that's going to create a horrible mess in your working directory, because they'd have to have, like, notebook name _output _n or something. We could push them in the IPython directory, but then they're kind of hidden away.
Yep.
But I mean,
can't put them in the IPython directory. Sorry. Go ahead,
are
Pat.
people already used to like untitled 0 through n.ipynb showing up all the time? Like,
Yeah, but
I think they're used to some amount of like kludge when they like launch a new notebook and stuff.
But
Like,
that
it would
means
just
the
appear locally.
untitled 0 through n is kind of an artifact of working on the notebook rather than working with the notebook. I mean, you'd have the same if you were testing Word and you kept on saving empty files.
I guess you would learn the first time once you make the mistake.
Well, and part of it is that in an ideal world, everyone using the notebook would understand exactly how big their data is and when they shouldn't try to look at it and print it or display it. And I think some level of, like, we don't want the user to do something that will crash the notebook or beach ball things, but having a little bit of pain and ugliness, like saying, look, you tried to do something that was not a good idea, now you need to clean it up, is, I think, okay. Right? I mean, this is what seg faults do, right?
Did we seriously just suggest seg faults as a programming paradigm that we should copy?
No, but
because no.
No, but actually, I mean, think about the alternative of a seg fault, right? It's that the computer just stops, like it goes to sleep.
Well, no, the alternative is you have a language that supports exceptions and tells you did something wrong, and then you can go on and handle it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like memory error is something that you get in Python,
let's try to aim for a slightly more graceful failure model than seg faults, because I think
the question,
then we are setting the bar way too low.
Writing to a file is reasonable if you're not automatically creating a link in the UI for elided output. Then you don't need the assumption that it's local and all. That's not a problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
I guess then the kind of question are, do you associate the output with the notebook? Like, do you write it to the CWD? I mean, you can't associate it with the notebook because the kernel doesn't know there's a notebook.
Yeah.
But do you write it to the current working directory, or do you write it to a temp file?
I mean, I would put it somewhere that they can access it using the kernel.
Yeah, but
Yeah, temp file.
the kernel can't put it anywhere else. But it's the question of whether it should be transient. Like, I would be slightly inclined to say, this is a big output. If you want to do something with it, do something with it. And if you're not going to do something with it, it's going to get cleaned up by the system.
Yeah.
In which case, a temp file.
Yeah.
But I think it's also perfectly reasonable that it would be a reasonable position to take to say this is output. I want to keep it. It's important. I just didn't display it. because then it's quite tedious. That if you've just got a bunch of print statements and you want to look at them, you have to move them out of the temporary directory if you got a temp file.
The other issue with this is that it puts the burden for implementing this logic on kernel implementers, and so we probably still want something in the UI that does something similar. Basically, watches messages come in. If they get above a certain point, stops, basically starts throwing them away and tells the user, hey, there's more output here than I know what to do with. I'm discarding them. You're losing this. You need to go back and do something.
Yeah, I think when you start discarding things, it becomes a lot trickier, right? Because if you've got, you should be paying attention to carriage returns and things, right? Because sending a megabyte of data that only ends up being 80 characters is fine.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like the opposite of compression.
Right?
Oh, no. I think, yes, obviously if someone's doing clear output or carriage returns to clear the output, then that's a different situation.
Yeah. But that means we need to add logic to monitor what output is actually, what's like the display. It's not how much output have I displayed, it's what the current display size is.
Yes.
And that's a lot of logic that's coupling the I/O streams to the display publisher, and that's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, but we ultimately though, we have to do something in the UI as sort of a last resort. If someone's running a kernel that doesn't implement some smart handling of large output, the UI needs to be able to have a safety valve, basically.
Yeah.
I agree. It's more difficult, but
getting it in memory is unless you're on a very slow connection.
Bless you.
Unless you're on a very slow connection, getting the large amount of output to the JSON getting the JSON to the JavaScript is not the majority of the cost. It's putting it on the page. So there's a big cost to lots of.
Yeah, the DOM is really bad.
So I think there's a good case to be made for stopping drawing output. I think it's a lot harder because the cost of just keeping the output in memory and not displaying it actually solves most of the problem.
Well, but think about
and is a lot, and the cost of doing that when people actually want to see it is low. The cost of throwing away data people want to see is really high.
And also I think there's JavaScript APIs now, so if we have a blob of text in memory, we can offer it to the user as a download. So you can say, this output, we have stopped showing this output because it's getting so long that it will slow your browser down, but click here to download it as a file.
Yeah, I'm hesitant. My assumption here is when we talk about big data, we're talking about big enough to be a problem, and then I'm hesitant to allow that amount of data to get in the notebook document.
But I think the main point is that the difference between a problem in the document and a problem on the page is huge.
Are different sizes.
It's really, really easy for it to be a problem to put it on the page. It's a lot harder if you're running on localhost, if you're running on a very slow internet connection, than adding a bunch of data. It is hard to have too much text.
Well, but I'm thinking about the multi-user server and also the Google Drive implementation where, like in Google Drive, an output appears, Google real-time API is going to sync that across all users, and that seems like
if you don't push on the page, then it's not getting synced, is it?
No, it's the thing that's synced is not the page, it's the notebook model. It's the actual notebook data, and so it would be.
But I mean, this could be in a, a front-end local cache of some kind without going immediately into the document.
Okay. No, I'm fine. Yeah. No, I'm fine with that. Like, telling users, this is large output. You can download it directly from this UI. It won't be in the notebook document. That's fine. Yeah. No, and I think part of it is we're just going to have to play with and understand what are the different output sizes that cause problems for different usage cases. One is the DOM, one is the local host network, the other is a sort of an open gigabit internet connection, and just play around with that. But it is, I mean, yeah.
So another direction, just I think that's worth mentioning, just so we can start thinking about it, is that whether or not we want to think about, and I think we should think about, let me make a statement. I think we should think about lazily rendering the document on the page. I think what we were talking about right now is sort of addressing the large output within one cell. But as notebooks grow, you don't want to tell users you can have a notebook so long as it has 100 cells, but you can't have a notebook that's 1,000 cells. That's too much.
Yeah.
Like we're going to have to go down that route if we're really to become ubiquitous. Is to sort of only render the context, as much context as you need to. The way snappy text editors don't read the whole 50 megabyte file when you open it. They show you enough for you to see, and you can process, things on the whole file, but that doesn't mean that you get to see all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's
yeah.
Sounds like a volunteer.
Yeah, I think we can take these things one bite at a time, but definitely we should get as far as that. And the last piece is right, because again, there's a big difference between what's a problem to get to memory and to get to the page. Right? Lazily rendering solves the problem where the notebook document is small enough that it's not a problem to get it to memory. It's not a problem to get the document to the browser, but it's a problem to render it. There's another transition where it's a problem to just get the document to the browser, and we can do paged requests to actually load the document itself.
Yeah.
Which again is just one more step of complexity. But yeah, I think ultimately maybe we want to get there, but one step at a time.
Yep. No. And there's a lot of.
One step at a time. That's not the way IPython works.
Actually, sometimes it is.
Once in a while we take steps.
I mean, the other issue there is that there's just a lot of re-engineering and redesign of things, because that's also related to real-time synchronization and sort of what parts of the notebook document are changing when, and how do you synchronize those between multiple front ends. But these are definitely issues we have to tackle. I mean, yeah. Hold on. My laptop's going to die here.
No.
All right. So shall we keep the discussion rolling on through the agenda?
Yeah.
Marching ever onward. Oh, someone else is doing it. Global events. Matthias isn't here, and I think he's the main person who disagrees with me. So
summarize your current state of the PR.
So custom.js basically doesn't work right now after the require PR was merged.
Right.
Because you cannot register, or it does if you just use set timeout.
Right.
Because you cannot register listeners for events. You cannot register listeners for events because the events object on which you register listeners doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, when custom.js is run.
I don't think it makes any sense for events to be anything other than global. I think events should be global. That's the right. All right. I can't think of a case where you wouldn't want that. So I have a PR that makes events a global.
And global in what sense?
Meaning you require events, and you get the events object on which you register and trigger events.
You get the events instance.
Yes.
Okay. So the other version of global is that you say window.events equals events.
Right. No, but yeah, I mean that if you have a handle on, if you have done enough to understand what events are,
Yeah.
then you can trigger events.
Yeah. No. I'm.
And okay.
I like the approach that's in the PR. I'm just looking at it now.
And Jason helped with loading custom.js at the right time, basically. The other option is to fully require JSify custom.js so that it exports a function that main calls. I think that's putting too much on users, but
yeah. So right now, with as of your pull request, the only case, I'm reading Jason's message. He says the only case I was initially worried about was embedding into a page, so you might have multiple kernels triggering events.
Yeah. So right now, okay, yeah, if you've got multiple kernels, since events are global, all those kernels are going to trigger the same kernel started event.
I think that's fine. You just need to pass the instance of the kernel with the event message so the receiver can determine what to do.
Yeah, which I don't think we do reliably. But
yeah, no, I think we don't. So right now, as of your pull request, in custom.js, if someone wants to define events, do they need to require base.js events to get the global events handle?
I don't actually know. I'll check. I have require statements in mine, so I'll make sure. They should. I don't know if they need to.
Yeah.
They should require events. I'm not sure if they have to.
Great. Yeah, I think this is great.
Okay.
And it's much. I mean, part of it is it's just much better in the actual code than the pre-required JS way of registering event listeners, right? Where you had to remember all this nasty syntax of dollar.
Well, it's just a different thing that you copy paste now, right? But it is a less nasty thing to copy paste.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul, compare HMAC.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a minor thing. I don't super care. I didn't see that you had left that comment on there, man. But so there's a more secure way of comparing HMAC digest that was suggested to us to the security list that we implement this, but it's only been implemented in Python 2.7.7, and so the question was, do we want to issue a warning to those not running 2.7.7 that we're doing this, that they're using something that potentially has sort of an increased timing attack surface?
So I thought the way we expose it, my understanding is you can't do the timing attack because you don't get a reply to do the timing on.
Yeah, it is actually impossible to, as far as we can tell, impossible to attack IPython with this.
Yeah, that was my impression. I talked to Kyle about this at the sprints, and we basically concluded that one, if you even could in theory do the timing attack, you would already have had to compromise our architecture in a devastating way.
That said, there should probably be a comment in there explaining what we're doing and why we're not raising a warning, just so that if anybody else goes and copies and pastes that code.
Yeah, because it's still technically a vulnerability of the session object, just not a vulnerability of the IPython kernel service that uses it. You could build an object in our session to implement a wire protocol and reply, "You're not authorized," rather than silence. So it would be possible to make yourself vulnerable to this.
Yes.
I tried and failed to do that. I spent one of the nights at SciPy trying to implement the timing attack and did not succeed. But
so then it's secure, right?
but I'm not a lead hacksaw, so
That's what he wants.
So looking at the pull request that's linked to this does implement the other way of it calls compare digest.
Mm-hmm.
Are we saying we don't want to merge this pull request? Or
The question is...
No. The question is, should we warn?
Yeah, should we warn for people? So we either use compare digest when it's available, and that's the even in the case where somebody else extends our thing and does start giving replies back, this decreases the surface of that attack, the attack surface, whatever, the gap, whatever.
Well,
And
it makes the timing attack impossible.
But
right.
hold on. But I thought that the way compare digest solves this problem is by making the call take a uniform amount of time for all inputs. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And it does,
of the same length.
Of the same length. Yeah.
If they're of different length, they'll take different times.
okay, but I thought that the performance hit would be big enough. And this happens on every single message that we can't do
right
this.
thing here
It's
at the
nanoseconds.
conference.
Nanoseconds.
Yeah.
The uniform time is like 1 to 200 nanoseconds.
Okay, so you okay. I was understanding it differently when Kyle and I talked. So you think that the time overhead is zero.
Uniform time is less than a microsecond. It's not.
Compared to all of the rest of our machinery that handles requests, like comparing two strings, like you could write your string comparison byte by byte with a Python loop, and it would still not have any measurable impact on.
Okay, that I understand. So we should. So I think that the take home is that even though we're not vulnerable to this attack, the time overhead is small enough that we should implement the fix so people know that.
Yeah, that
other
was
people use
never in question.
Yeah, the only question was whether we should warn people on old Pythons, because I checked and I guess it's now it's out of date LTS, but still supported.
Yeah.
1204 is still old enough that, and since there is actually no vulnerability in IPython, that
Minfit does not have it. Yeah.
that I think a warning might be going too far, because there isn't actually any vulnerability.
Yeah, I don't think we want to warn when this is run in IPython.
Okay. So I'll just update that.
If you could implement constant, if you want to eliminate the warning and eliminate the vulnerability, you could write constant time comparison.
Right.
Right, just for character in. You just compare the whole string, and it will take the same amount of time every time.
I think it had some clever implementation using like bitwise XOR or something.
Yeah.
I saw a pure Python
And there wouldn't be
implementation that was
anything to warn
better than
about.
a for loop.
But yeah, okay. Success.
Yay.
Sweet. Great.
Next.
Project management software, Brian.
Yeah, so this is sort of spawned out of some discussions at SciPy with both Fernando, Flip, the founder of InfoChimps, and basically, as we start to work with more people, we're getting. Obviously, the collaboration with Google is going on, but also we're getting other contributions from people like Jason and Sylvan. How do we sort of scale our organization up? And basically, I'm trying a couple of different project management software to see, would this make sense for us? How would we use it? And so the current one I'm trying is Trello. I think Trello, Asana, and Pivotal and Waffle we could use for free as an open source project. Backpack, I don't think has any open source free versions available. And I've been talking to people who have used these software over the last week, and basically my conclusion was we just need to try these things out. So I'm currently trying out Trello with a student I have working on some other stuff, and then I'm going to try out Trello with Adrian, the designer that we're bringing on, just to try at a very small scale, not a project scale, but like, what does this look like? Is there a good workflow here? It's not about GitHub. So, and actually, Jason Grout said in HipChat, "Are you saying GitHub doesn't scale?"
Right.
No, and so I think one thing that I asked Flip and that I talked about with Fernando was, like, isn't this just reinventing GitHub issues? Are we supposed to be using GitHub issues for this? And basically what sort of I wouldn't call it a consensus, but some of the ideas around it was that that the goal of this type of software would be more for managing our roadmap, sort of that's sort of one step more conceptual than GitHub issues. And basically, when I described to Flip how we do our road mapping, and he basically said, "Oh yeah, that's what this is for, to sort of managing the big picture in a more dynamic way." And that is a problem with our roadmap, is that we do it every 6 months right now, and then for the next 6 months we basically ignore that roadmap, and it becomes a very static format.
A software solution will make a whole lot of difference to what we do with that.
You do, or you don't think it will?
I said I do, but I was being sarcastic.
Okay, but no, I mean, this is the question. And this is why I just want to try it out. And then I think the idea is that GitHub issues would be attached to these big idea things and describe sort of the technical implementation details of them. But again, this is all just hypothesizing. Maybe we'll try it out for a while and we'll say, no, this is stupid. I just don't know. But I would say if any of you want to just try these different things, any of them, all of them, I mean, helping gather data on how useful these things would be would be helpful. And so I mean, I'm more than willing to participate in any of these experiments. Like, I mean, maybe John, we want to try doing some of the widget-related road mapping on Asana or Waffle, or I mean, like, we just need to try it out.
Yeah, I've been using Trello for my job search right now, and I find it just absolutely invaluable to keep track of all the different companies where I've applied, what the latest status is, what I'm waiting on, just shifting things around. I think the point is, I think like a software solution does make a difference. Thomas has seen me do this, right? It's like making work visible. It's trying to figure out what's on your plate right now. Like the GitHub view is just terrible at organizing like what I'm currently working on, what I'm waiting to hear feedback on, what it is that, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I think it's sort of, it's a way of also making that explicit for outsiders. So like, I think one of the things that Katie Huff talked about in her sci-fi talk is like, mark down the things that you're working on so that people aren't afraid to start working on it. Like, if we don't mark down the issues that we're working to address, then people are afraid to contribute.
Well, and this is where people look at our roadmap. They can see what we may be working on.
Right, yeah.
But there's no way that they can tell, oh gosh, right now, this is what the team is working on. So here's a question, Paul.
I think there's a bigger problem with that external involvement, which is that even if we're not actively working on something yet, we've probably had discussions and ideas about how we want to do it, and if someone comes and tries to do it, then quite a lot of the time we have to say, thanks for having a go at this, but we actually want to do it a completely different way.
But I think when a non-core developer, I mean, let's say we had a column of things we're not yet working on, but that are sort of on our roadmap, we could encourage the community to say when they want to work on something, drag it over to the currently working on things, and then we could know, oh, someone's working on this.
Someone is, yeah. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So, Paul, I have a question. How many, like the Trello board I'm using right now with my student, we're just using the default columns. What are they called? They are called, let me pull up the board here. To do, doing, and done. Which is sort of a very simplistic model of this. I could imagine that, like, you would want, like, roadmap ideas that we're planning on doing, like we're really, really planning on doing, and then sort of blue sky crazy, like, well, maybe someday we'll do this.
Right, yeah.
Do you, as you worked with this in your job search, did you end up creating more than 3 columns and doing a more sophisticated management of that? Or what did that look like for you?
Yeah, I started with the same 3 columns, and then I sort of, every once in a while, add a new column. So right now I have sort of, going from left to right, I have maybe, then I have not started, so things that I want to do but I haven't started. Then I have to do, waiting, done, on hold, which is different than waiting. Waiting is where it's like, on hold is that everything's completed and it's just that they're waiting to hear back from me. Waiting is where I'm waiting. And then there's no-go column where it's like, it's done for whatever reason, it's not going to work out. And that's sort of like, so it's cleared off my plate.
Okay. Because that's, I mean, part of what I'm trying to understand is if something like Waffle.io, which has a fixed set of columns, is too restrictive.
I think so, yeah.
And
They're not. No, you can add columns in Waffle. I did that yesterday.
Oh, okay. How did
It's
you do
not
that?
as obvious as Trello was, though.
And how is that?
Let me go back to it.
How is that information included in? Let's see here.
Which one did you add, or did you not add it to the IPython repo, Kyle?
You can.
It was on my Atom script repo.
Yeah, you can do under project settings, columns. You can add columns.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
And you can manage the.
I love it.
You can do quite a bit of stuff. So one thing that would probably be useful is, maintaining the state of pull requests that are waiting on review and waiting on response to review.
Yeah.
Those are things we have difficulty keeping track of. Right? Because if they're waiting on response to review, we don't need to look at them. If they're waiting on review, then
Right. And
I mean,
does Trello have integration with GitHub?
I don't know. I've not
I'm
looked.
not sure. I'm not
I
sure.
don't, doesn't seem to.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing about Waffle.io is that for a repo like IPython, it's basically useless because it's gonna add all of our open issues to one of those things, and we just can't. Like that's not the high level information we want to be using.
Well, it's gonna add them. There's going to be a pile of.
On the left.
Yeah, there's going to be an unsorted pile. And that's fine.
It does integrate with your labels.
So
I'm not sure if we could just take the labels that we already have on issues and then make it so that those get shifted into the right buckets.
Okay. Yeah, but
and still we'd have to do something. It's not going to be automatic.
Okay. Well,
automatic.
Yeah. But no, Paul, thanks. That's really helpful to sort of hear how you were using Trello, and we'll, let's just keep playing around with this stuff. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I've also started using it personally for my to-do list, And I also find myself sort of every once in a while, as the buckets fill up, adding just more buckets. So I had like a generic to-do bucket, and then it was like it changed into like an extra one that's to do this week, and then that became too long, and there's another level of like to do today, and so I sort of dragged things from left to right of like things that I'm actually committed to doing today, and then things that I wanted to get done this week, and then sort of there's a backlog of things that I want to work on.
Okay. No, this is, I mean, yeah, this is really, I think figuring something like this out would help us both internally as a team, but do a lot in communicating with the people who are not core devs,
Yeah.
Who are either like Jason and Sylvan, who are working closely with us, or true new people who want to like look, okay, what are they currently working on? What is the next thing? What are, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it looks like, just back to Waffle, it looks like it's really easy to select which GitHub label you want a column to correspond to. So basically there's a one-to-one mapping. There's a way out. Even if we start using Waffle and we want to use something else, or you want to just use the GitHub UI as is, and the filtering there, you can just select a label that's like, we could make a column for, whatever the next release is, and that will be, things tagged for that release will be in that column.
Milestones?
It looks like it's labels only.
Okay.
And we may, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, this looks really interesting. I'll play with this as well.
And it looks like, I mean, the one concern that I had was being a collaborator on the repo, I can move stuff around willy-nilly, and I was worried about either having to grant other people access to moving issues around, or having to us do it ourselves. And it looks like there's a way that at least for PRs where you can have the PR maker be able to move their own labels around.
So,
like,
Paul, what view do you see on IPython now on Waffle?
On IPython now on Waffle, I see backlog ready, in progress, and backlog ready, in progress, and done. That's all I see.
And did you move all the ones into in progress?
No, I didn't. I think somebody else did.
Oh, I guess I don't know who would have done that.
In
I wasn't
progress,
sure.
things are automatically added to in progress when they're a PR from someone with push access to the repo, a collaborator on the repo.
Ah, here
There
we
you
go.
go.
I tried to move a card. It told me only collaborators can. So this is the view for everyone.
Right.
Yeah, it's one view for everybody on the repo.
Okay, cool.
So,
But if you made a PR, Kyle, I think you would be able to move it yourself.
Okay, cool.
I think that's what I'm picking up. At least if we enable that in the project settings.
Yeah. But I would probably, if I was there, I would just close the PR, like if I wanted to close it.
Right.
But I guess this allows someone else to manage their own and like state their own.
Exactly.
Where they're
Like,
at. Yeah.
I need review is yeah. Or I'm
This just
done
scares
with the
me as
review.
being extra work instead of, just using what's there. But yeah, GitHub is hard on its own for project management.
Yeah. So I'm confused. My URL in Waffle says waffle.io/Jupyter/design.
Okay.
And I have one card that I created for Jupyter Design just as a test in the backlog area. That appears.
Okay.
But then I also see all the cards for IPython.
Whoa, weird. Yeah, I see that too.
Whoa.
whoa, yeah, me too. That what?
What is going on there? What?
That's
not what I expected.
Well, file a bug, I guess. I'll do that now.
yeah, that's I'm
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that is a bug.
pretty sure that's a bug.
Did you just type the URL in directly? Is that how you ended up at that?
No.
I'm going to go to
I did.
IndyViewer.
How did you
And it looks totally normal.
How did you end up with it?
Well, in this case, I just typed the actual URL at the top. Like I just changed it to IPython, or Jupyter/design.
And that fixed it for you?
And for NBViewer, it was fine. And then I'll go back to Jupyter Design. And my connection's hanging. Okay, there we go. Yeah, and this is all the IPython stuff. What's up with this?
So looking at the project settings, the IPython one is somehow connected to Jupyter Design as well. So we can actually, you can trash it. So you can actually connect multiple repos to one project.
Okay. So when I added,
I fixed it.
thank you.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's back to Foo.
Yeah, so you can have one board with multiple repos.
Which makes
so
this would be a way to unify NB Viewer so that I start looking at it.
We don't need to make you look at it. You don't need to look at it.
Okay, it just works, right?
It's magic.
Okay. Well, let's keep playing with this stuff. You know, this is great. I'm glad that other people are developing software like this, so we don't have to.
Yep. And waffles. I mean.
I like waffles. Alright, so that's that.
Yep.
Last thing on the agenda, Thomas, Mistune.
So the Mistune Markdown rendering PR, I want to merge it. I did some review of it with John. Does anyone want to do any more review before I merge it? It's passing tests and things. I've just rebased it so it merges cleanly.
I'm fine with you going ahead.
That's what I wanted to hear.
The only thing to check is to make so. Well, I guess okay. The way it's written now, I think Mistune will not. If you don't have Mistune, you can't start the notebook. I think.
Quite possibly.
Why is that?
Because Mistune is an unconditional import NB-convert, and the NB-convert handlers import NB-convert.
Oh.
It's fine to say that's fine. If it's not fine, then we can move the imports to a lower level, so that they fail at runtime.
Yeah, well, at least, or at least it should be expressed in setup.py that that Mistune is a dependency on for the notebook as well, because that's not the way that it's written right now.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm misreading the diff. Sorry. Oh, it's the red is the stuff that's gone. Is that the way it works?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so that's if people agree that that's fine, that's fine with me.
I'm taking your silence as a yes. That's fine.
I find it weird, but not weird enough to object against it. But I do find it weird that you would need that for the notebook.
Well, it's because it's a question of can you have less than all of the notebook, right?
Yeah, and I think yes, because that's what you've been able to do before, right?
Yeah,
so.
But we also haven't been able to express dependencies on NB-convert stuff, so we've needed that because we can't even say we couldn't get a pip install IPython notebook that makes NB-convert work.
Right.
One of the advantages of Mistune is that we can now.
Right. Yeah.
So now we can say the notebook includes NB-convert to HTML.
That's fine.
I think it's okay.
Yeah.
It's less confusing.
Yeah, when we discussed this at some point and came to the conclusion that the notebook should imply the ability to export HTML, but not necessarily the ability to export to LaTeX or something.
Cool.
Yeah, to LaTeX is trivial, but rendering LaTeX is non-trivial.
Great. Okay. Then you go ahead and push the button.
Woo.
And that's that.
Excellent.
Done.
Well, push the button.
Oh, you beat me to it, Paul. Well done.
All right.
I'm happy it got merged.
All right. That's everything for this week. Until next time.
All right.
Goodbye, internets.
Bye.
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 Bye, Kyle.
Bye, everyone.